The lake was calm that morning, its surface reflecting the pale sky like a mirror. An old man, known by the townsfolk for his daily fishing trips, rowed his small boat from the creaking dock near his cabin. He waved to a neighbor, promising to return by noon with his usual catch, but as the sun set and the waters darkened, the boat drifted back empty. No gear, no man, no trace of where he had gone. The cabin by the lake had stood for generations, its wooden walls weathered by storms and sun alike. Locals said it belonged as much to the water as it did to the man who lived there. Henry Whitlock, 72, was a familiar sight in the small town of Graymoor. Every morning, no matter the season, he could be seen rowing his battered boat into the mist, a thermos of coffee at his side and a fishing rod across his knees. Henry had lived alone since his wife's passing a decade earlier. He filled the silence with routine, mending nets, whittling small wooden animals on his porch, and casting lines into the lake he claimed knew him better than anyone. Children called him the Lake Man, and though he rarely spoke much, he always greeted passers-by with a wave. To the townsfolk, Henry's presence was a constant, as steady as the tides. That morning began like any other. The sun struggled to break through heavy grey clouds, and a thin fog clung to the water's surface. A neighbor spotted Henry at the dock, securing his tackle box and tightening the rope on his small rowboat. "Going out early, Henry?" she called. He lifted a hand in reply, smiling faintly. "Fish won't catch themselves," he said, before pushing off into the mist. Hours passed. By late morning, the fog lifted, revealing a wide expanse of still water. The town bustled with its usual rhythm, shopkeepers opening their stores, children heading to school, the postman making his rounds. No one gave Henry much thought. He had been making these trips for years, always returning before sundown with a modest catch. But as evening fell and the first lights flickered on across the lake shore, unease began to spread. At dusk, the boat was found. It drifted silently toward the dock, its bow bumping gently against the wooden posts. Inside lay Henry's tackle box, neatly closed, and his fishing rod resting across the seat. But there was no sign of Henry himself. The oars were still in place, the thermos of coffee half full, steam long gone. It was as though he had simply vanished between one cast and the next. By nightfall, word of his disappearance spread quickly. Neighbors gathered at the shoreline, lanterns casting golden circles on the dark water. They called his name, their voices swallowed by the vastness of the lake. Some claimed they saw ripples far from shore, as if something had disturbed the surface. Others swore they heard a faint splash, though the night remained otherwise still. Sheriff Ellen Carver was called to the scene. A practical woman in her 50s, she had known Henry since childhood. She examined the boat with a grim expression. "No sign of a struggle," she murmured. "Everything's in place." She looked out across the water, its black surface reflecting only the pale moonlight. "But where is he?" The search began at first light. Volunteers combed the shoreline while boats fanned out across the lake. Divers plunged into the icy depths near the dock, searching for any trace of the old man. Hours turned into days, yet nothing surfaced. No clothing, no body, not even the faintest clue. Locals whispered theories. Some said Henry had grown tired of solitude and simply walked away, abandoning his life without farewell. Others suggested a hidden illness, that he had chosen the lake as his final resting place. But those who knew Henry best dismissed such notions. "He loved this place too much," one neighbor said. "He wouldn't leave it, not like that." As days turned into weeks, the lake seemed to guard its secret closely. The water remained calm, indifferent to the searchers who scoured its depths. And each evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the dock creaked softly in the wind, the empty space where Henry should have stood a reminder of the mystery that now gripped the town. The townsfolk of Graymoor were unsettled in a way they had not been in years. Henry's disappearance wasn't just the loss of an old man, it was the unraveling of a constant in their lives. For decades he had been the first to greet the dawn and the last to leave the shoreline. Now his absence echoed like a bell tolling over the water. Sheriff Ellen Carver set up a small command post by the dock. Maps of the lake were spread across a folding table, red circles marking the areas divers had already searched. Volunteers signed in, rowboats were checked, and radios crackled with updates. The community was determined to bring Henry home, yet the lake gave nothing back. Day after day, divers came up shaking their heads. Visibility's near zero, one muttered, water dripping from his mask. Feels like the bottom just drops away. Fishermen, usually eager to boast of their catches, now avoided the water altogether. They whispered about the currents, how sometimes nets snagged on things too heavy to pull, only to come up empty when reeled in again. Stranger still were the reports from those who lived nearest the water. A widow named Martha claimed she saw Henry's boat drifting far from shore, days after it had been recovered. It was him, she insisted. I know the shape of his shoulders. He was rowing, but when I called his name, the boat was gone. Another neighbor swore he heard whistling at dawn, the same tune Henry always hummed when he fished. Yet the shoreline was empty. Ellen listened to each account, scribbling notes, though she kept her skepticism guarded. She trusted evidence, not ghost stories. Still, she couldn't ignore the unease crawling up her spine whenever she looked out over the water. On the fifth night, Ellen decided to patrol the lake herself. She borrowed a small motorboat and pushed off into the darkness, the engine humming softly. The moon was bright, casting silver light across the glassy surface. She steered toward the center, guided by instinct more than plan. Halfway across, the engine sputtered and died. The silence was sudden, oppressive. The lake stretched in every direction, a black mirror swallowing the stars. Ellen reached for the oars, her hands trembling slightly. That was when she heard it, faint but unmistakable. A splash. She froze, scanning the water with her flashlight. Ripples spread across the surface, vanishing into the night. Another splash followed, closer this time. Then a sound that made her blood run cold, the creak of wooden oars dipping into water. Ellen turned sharply, light cutting through the darkness. For a moment, she swore she saw a boat, small, weathered, identical to Henry's, gliding silently across the lake. A figure sat within, hunched and motionless, but when she blinked, it was gone. The water smooth once more. Her breath came fast, fogging in the cool night air. She rowed back to shore, her heart pounding with each stroke. When she finally stepped onto the dock, Frank the storekeeper was waiting with a lantern. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes was enough. The next morning, Ellen reviewed her notes again. Logic told her Henry had drowned, an accident, a slip, a sudden weakness in his old age. But the evidence, or lack of it, told another story. No body, no clothing, no disturbance in the mud below, only sightings, whispers and ripples on the water that came without wind. The town began to change. Fishermen avoided the lake. Children were forbidden from swimming. The once bustling dock now sat quiet, its planks creaking under the weight of absence. Some locals left offerings, flowers, candles, even Henry's favorite tobacco, placed on the pier as if to appease the lake itself. And yet, each evening, as the fog crept back across the water, the townsfolk swore they saw a shape drifting just beyond reach, a boat with a lone figure, rowing endlessly, never arriving, never leaving. Ellen tried to dismiss it as grief, as imagination, but deep down, she wondered if Henry Whitlock was truly gone, or if the lake had claimed him, holding him in its silent, endless depths. The search for Henry stretched into its second week, and though the official operation dwindled, the whispers only grew louder. The town of Graymoor, once a place of routine and quiet, found itself shadowed by unease. The diner that usually buzzed with morning chatter now fell silent whenever the lake was mentioned. Shopkeepers spoke in hushed tones, and children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Sheriff Ellen Carver, burdened with the responsibility of answers, dug deeper. She interviewed anyone who had lived in Graymoor long enough to remember the town's darker days. It was an elderly man named Lowell Grady who finally gave her something more than superstition. He sat on his porch, pipe smoke curling around his face, and said, "Henry ain't the first. Lake's been taking people for years. Most were strangers, travelers passing through, easy to forget. But some were ours." Ellen leaned forward. "What do you mean, ours?" Lowell's eyes narrowed. "There was a boy in 78, 15 years old, loved fishing just like Henry. One morning he rowed out, never came back. They found his boat floating by the reeds, neat as a picture, but no boy. And a woman, back in the 50s, said she used to sit by the shore and hum. One day she hummed her way straight into the water. Folks swore they saw her dress floating just beneath the surface for weeks." Ellen jotted it all down, though the words chilled her. If true, Henry's disappearance was part of a pattern that stretched back decades. "Why hasn't anyone reported this?" she asked. Lowell shrugged. "They did. But what good came of it? Papers wrote it up, called it accidents. The rest got filed away and forgotten. Easier that way." That night, Ellen stayed late at her office, poring over dusty archives. She found old clippings, thin columns buried in the back pages of county newspapers. Teen drowns in Graymoor Lake. Body not recovered. Local woman vanishes. Boat found empty. Authorities call off search. Always the same story. Always the same lake. The pieces unsettled her, but she knew the town needed calm. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the water itself held something darker. When she finally closed her eyes at her desk, her dreams carried her back to the lake, the endless ripples, the faint sound of oars, and Henry's voice calling her name. The following evening, she returned to the dock. The air was cool, fog rolling thick across the water. Lanterns glowed faintly along the shoreline, placed by neighbors in quiet vigil. Ellen stood there, scanning the horizon, and then she saw it. Far out on the water, a small light flickered, like a lantern swaying in a boat. She grabbed her binoculars, heart pounding. The image was blurry in the mist, but she could just make out a hunched figure rowing slowly, steadily toward the center of the lake. "Henry!" she shouted, though she knew he couldn't hear. The boat drifted forward, lantern swinging, and then, without warning, the light went out. The figure vanished, swallowed whole by fog. Gasps rose from the small crowd gathered at the dock. Ellen turned to them, but their pale faces mirrored her own fear. "You saw that?" she demanded. Heads nodded, murmurs rippling through the group. For the first time, it wasn't just whispers, it was undeniable. The next morning, Ellen sent divers again, focusing on the lake's center. They found nothing. Not a lantern, not a boat, not even disturbed silt below. Just silence. As word spread, the legend of Henry Whitlock grew. Some said he had become part of the lake, cursed to row its surface forever. Others believed the lake was a doorway, pulling people into a place from which there was no return. Parents warned their children never to linger by the water. And though Ellen tried to keep the investigation grounded, she could feel the town slipping into belief. Each evening, as the fog crept back, more people gathered at the dock, waiting for the faint glow of a lantern that might or might not appear. The lake had become a stage, and the townsfolk its unwilling audience. And in the silence that followed each night's vigil, one truth lingered unspoken. If the lake had claimed Henry, it could claim another. Sheriff Ellen Carver had built her career on facts, fingerprints, timelines, interviews, evidence. But standing on the dock at Graymoor Lake, she felt those anchors slipping away. Too many witnesses had seen too much. Too many stories from the past matched Henry's disappearance with eerie precision. Logic said the old man had drowned, but the absence of proof, the echoes of history, whispered something else. She decided to broaden the search. With the help of county officials, sonar equipment was brought in from the nearest city. For 3 days, boats moved slowly across the water, sending out pulses and reading the shapes beneath. The results were baffling. While much of the lakebed appeared as expected, there were areas, pockets, voids that didn't make sense. Deep pits where the readings went black as though the signal had been swallowed. Ellen studied the maps late into the night. "It's like the lake has holes in it," she muttered. "Places that shouldn't exist." Frank, the storekeeper, leaned over her shoulder. "Maybe that's where it takes them." She gave him a sharp look. "Takes them?" He nodded grimly. "Henry, the boy, the woman in the 50s. They all vanished in storms, in fog. The lake's not just deep, it's hungry." Ellen dismissed the notion aloud, but his words stuck with her. That night, she dreamed of standing on the dock while the water beneath her feet opened like a mouth, black and endless, pulling her under. The next evening she returned to the shoreline, determined to confront her fear. Lanterns glowed again, townsfolk gathering as if by instinct. Children clutched their parents' hands, staring wide-eyed at the mist. Ellen set her jaw, refusing to let superstition dictate the town's fate. She stepped into a borrowed rowboat and pushed off, ignoring the murmurs behind her. The water was unnervingly calm, the fog thick enough to blur the shore within minutes. She rowed toward one of the black voids marked on the sonar map. Her breath came slow and steady, though her pulse raced. When she reached the spot, she stopped, letting the boat drift. The silence was immense. Then came the sound. A creak, faint but clear, the unmistakable rhythm of oars. Ellen's flashlight cut across the fog, and there it was again, a shape in the distance. a small boat gliding silently across the water. This time she saw the lantern more clearly, its light swinging gently. "Henry," she called, her voice carrying into the night. The figure paused, head turning as if to look directly at her. For one agonizing moment, Ellen believed she saw his face, pale, drawn, eyes hollow but aware. He raised a hand, trembling, almost as if in greeting. Then the lantern winked out, the boat vanished. Ellen's heart pounded. She rowed furiously toward where the light had been, but the water was empty, undisturbed. No ripples, no trace, just endless fog. When she returned to shore, soaked in sweat, the townsfolk crowded her, demanding answers. She shook her head, unable to speak. Her silence told them everything. They knew she had seen him. The murmurs grew into fear, fear into conviction. Henry Whitlock wasn't lost. He had been taken, like the others. The legend hardened that night. Graymoor Lake became more than water. It became a warning. Children were forbidden even to step near the shore. Fishermen refused to launch their boats. And each evening, as the fog rolled in, more people swore they saw a pale figure rowing just beyond reach, lantern swinging in the dark. Ellen sat alone in her office, replaying the image of Henry's hollow eyes. She thought of the sonar voids, the whispered stories, the decades of disappearances. Slowly she began to write, not a police report, but a confession. Something in the lake is alive, and it is not finished with us. The following morning, Sheriff Ellen Carver locked her handwritten confession in her desk drawer. She knew she couldn't share it, at least not yet. If the county commissioner read her words about a living lake, she'd be removed from duty within hours. Still, she needed to act. Something in Graymoor Lake was claiming lives, and Henry Whitlock was only the most recent. She returned to the sonar maps, tracing the black voids with her finger. 3 distinct spots, each marked by total silence in the readings, as if the lake bottom simply wasn't there. 2 matched the sites of older disappearances. The third, she realized with a shiver, was where Henry had last been seen. By late afternoon, she gathered a small group of trusted volunteers, Frank the storekeeper, Martha the widow, and 2 younger deputies who still had faith in her. "We're not going to find Henry on the surface," she said. "If he's anywhere, it's in one of these voids. Tonight we check for ourselves." As the sun dipped behind the hills, the group launched 2 boats. Lanterns glowed against the fog, casting narrow circles of light. The water was still, the air heavy with anticipation. Ellen steered toward the nearest void, her jaw set, heart pounding. For an hour, nothing happened. They floated in silence, the only sound the creak of oars and the occasional murmur between them. But then Martha gasped and pointed. A faint glow shimmered across the water, a lantern, swinging slowly in the mist. "It's him," she whispered. Ellen raised her binoculars. There he was again, Henry, hunched in his boat, eyes hollow, hand gripping the oar with unnatural stiffness. She shouted his name, but the figure did not respond. Instead, the boat glided closer, lantern swaying, until it stopped directly across from them. The group sat frozen. The water between the boats rippled softly, though no wind stirred. Ellen's voice trembled as she called again. "Henry, it's Ellen. We're here to bring you home." For a moment, Henry's head tilted, as though he recognized her. Then, slowly, his mouth opened. No sound came out. Only the distant, hollow creak of unseen oars echoed around them. Suddenly, the lantern extinguished. The boat vanished, and the water beneath Ellen's boat surged. A violent ripple rocked them side to side. Frank cried out, clutching the edge. Something moved below, something vast, its shape indiscernible but unmistakably alive. A chill spread through the air, raising goosebumps on their skin. "Back to shore," Ellen ordered, her voice sharp. They rowed furiously, hearts pounding, every splash of oars sounding like thunder. Behind them, the lake groaned, a low vibration that seemed to rise from its depths. When they reached the dock, the townsfolk waiting with lanterns saw their faces, pale, shaken, eyes wide with terror. Ellen said nothing. She didn't need to. Everyone could see the truth written across her expression. From that night on, Graymoor Lake was no longer just a body of water. It was a presence, an entity the town could not deny. The fishermen locked away their nets, the children no longer dared skip stones, and even the bravest souls refused to row after dark. Still, the sightings continued, lanterns in the mist, a figure rowing endlessly, face pale as moonlight, sometimes alone, sometimes joined by faint shapes behind him. Others the lake had taken, rowing in silence. Ellen returned often, unable to stop herself. She stood at the dock with her recorder, documenting every ripple, every sighting. She told herself it was for evidence, but deep down she knew it was something else. She was listening, and one evening, as the fog thickened, she swore she heard Henry's voice at last, faint, broken, carried on the water. "Don't let them in." Sheriff Ellen Carver couldn't escape Henry's voice. "Don't let them in." The words haunted her waking hours, threaded through her dreams, and echoed across every quiet moment by the water. She replayed the sound on her recorder dozens of times, adjusting the volume, straining to catch more than the faint whisper. Each time it was the same. 4 words, trembling with desperation. What did he mean? Who were they? And how could the lake, a body of water, carry voices at all? Ellen began piecing together what little history she could find about Graymoor Lake. The archives offered scraps, mentions of the land before the town was founded, vague references to strange drownings and restless waters. Old maps showed the lake had once been much smaller, fed by underground springs that carved caverns deep below. Those caverns, she realized, could explain the sonar voids, the missing pieces in the lakebed where sound disappeared into darkness. But the history held something more. Buried in a brittle journal from 1891 was a passage that made her stomach turn. Voices heard beneath the fog. Fishermen speak of shadows rowing in the mist. Do not answer when they call, for the water remembers. Ellen read it twice, her hands trembling. The words were over a century old, yet they mirrored the present perfectly. Henry wasn't the first to warn from beyond. The lake had been taking people long before her time, long before Henry's. Determined to understand, Ellen returned to the shoreline alone. The fog was thick, rolling low across the surface like smoke. She stood at the end of the dock, recorder in hand, and waited. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the lapping of water against wood. Just as she began to think the night would yield nothing, the ripples appeared. At first gentle, then stronger, as if something stirred far below. A faint glow emerged in the mist, a lantern swaying back and forth. Ellen's breath caught. The boat materialized slowly, Henry's hunched figure rowing with mechanical precision. His eyes caught the lantern light, pale and lifeless, yet fixed directly on her. She lifted the recorder. "Henry, it's Ellen. What do you mean, don't let them in?" The boat drifted closer, the oars slicing silently through the water. Henry's mouth opened, but his voice was lost to the wind. The recorder, however, crackled with sound. Not just one voice, but many. Dozens, layered atop each other, whispering in unison. "Don't open the way." The words chilled her to her core. She staggered back, the dock groaning under her weight. The lantern extinguished. The boat dissolved into fog, but the whispers lingered in the recorder, looping endlessly until she snapped it off. The following day, Ellen confided in Martha, the widow who had first claimed to see Henry after his disappearance. Martha listened silently, then nodded. "My husband drowned in this lake 15 years ago," she said quietly. "They never found him, but sometimes I hear him outside my window at night, his voice calling me. I thought I was losing my mind." Ellen gripped her hand. "You're not. The lake is keeping them. But for what?" That night, unable to sleep, Ellen sketched out a plan. If the lake was a doorway, as the journal suggested, then the sonar voids were its thresholds. She would return with divers, not to search aimlessly, but to target those exact spots. If Henry's warning meant anything, she had to know what lay beneath. But even as she prepared, she couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was watching her. Its calm surface hid too much, and in the silence between the ripples, she thought she heard another voice, one that wasn't Henry's, whispering her name. The following evening, Sheriff Ellen Carver stood at the water's edge with 2 volunteer divers. Both were experienced men from the neighboring county, skeptical but willing. She showed them the sonar maps, pointing to the deepest void. "That's where he vanished," she said. "That's where we go." The divers exchanged a look. One finally muttered, "If there's an underground cavern, currents could pull anything under. But if you're right, if there's something down there, we might not come back." Ellen nodded grimly. "That's why I'll stay here. If you find anything, anything at all, you signal with the line. 3 pulls." As the sun bled into the horizon, the men donned their gear and slipped into the black water. Their lanterns bobbed briefly on the surface before vanishing into the depths. Ellen held the guide rope tightly, every muscle tense. The town had gathered silently behind her, watching with lanterns of their own. Minutes passed, then an hour. The rope twitched once, then again. Ellen braced herself, counting. 1, 2, 3. Relief surged. They had found something. She began to pull, expecting resistance, but the line came free too easily, as if cut. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The water lay calm, lanterns reflecting in eerie stillness. No bubbles rose, no divers surfaced, only silence. Ellen's heart pounded. She barked orders, sending for backup, but deep down she knew the lake had taken them too. That night, she played back her recorder, desperate for clues. The static crackled, then cleared. Voices emerged, faint but layered. Not Henry this time. The divers. Their words were fragmented, muffled by water, but she caught phrases. Not a cave. They're everywhere. Pull us back. Then screams, then silence. Ellen pressed her palms to her face. The town was unraveling, and she had no answers. Yet Henry's warning echoed louder than ever. Don't let them in. If the voids were thresholds, then the divers hadn't just disappeared. They had crossed. The next day, Ellen stood before the townsfolk in the square. She told them the truth. Not the whole truth, but enough. The lake was dangerous. No one was to enter its waters, not for fishing, not for swimming, not even to retrieve a boat. She ordered the dock boarded and the shoreline fenced. Some obeyed, others resisted. This lake built this town. One fisherman protested. We can't just abandon it. But the fear in his eyes betrayed him. The townsfolk had seen too much. They had heard the whispers, seen the lanterns. The legends had become reality. That night, Ellen patrolled the shoreline alone. The fog rolled thick, muffling her footsteps. She paused by the boarded dock, listening. At first, nothing but the wind, then faintly, the sound of oars dipping into water. She froze. Slowly, the glow of a lantern materialized beyond the mist. But this time, there were more than one. Dozens of lights flickered across the surface, bobbing like a procession. Boats upon boats, drifting silently, each with a figure hunched within. Ellen's breath caught. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, their motions mechanical. Henry among them. The boy from 1978, the divers, even others she couldn't name, all rowing endlessly, bound in silence. She staggered back, heart racing. The recorder in her pocket clicked on by itself, capturing the chorus of whispers rising from the lake. Don't let them in. Don't let them in. Ellen fled, but she knew the truth. The lake wasn't just claiming lives, it was building something, gathering souls. And whatever they were, the threshold was widening. The image of those ghostly boats haunted Sheriff Ellen Carver long after she left the shoreline. She could not erase the faces. Henry, the boy, the divers, rowing endlessly, their lanterns swinging in silent rhythm. The vision left her shaken, but also certain of one thing. The lake was no longer content to keep its secrets hidden. It was showing itself, piece by piece, as if preparing for something larger. In the days that followed, the town of Graymoor changed. Families packed and left, abandoning homes that had stood for generations. Fishermen sold their boats, storefronts closed early, and the once bustling diner stood nearly empty. Those who remained walked with haunted eyes, glancing nervously at the water, even in daylight. The lake had become a boundary no one dared cross, but Ellen couldn't leave. She was sheriff, and more than that she felt tethered to Henry's warning. Don't let them in. If the lake was a doorway, then her duty wasn't just to protect the town from its waters, it was to prevent whatever lay beyond from crossing through. She spent her nights at the station, reviewing the recordings again and again. The whispers grew clearer each time, as though the more she listened, the more they wanted to be heard. One phrase repeated above all others, "The way is opening." Ellen knew she had to act. She returned to the boarded dock, pried open the planks and dragged a small boat to the water's edge. If the lake was preparing to open away, she needed to see it firsthand before it was too late. The fog was heavier than ever as she rowed into the center. Lantern light flickered in the distance, the ghostly procession already waiting. Dozens of boats drifted slowly, their figures moving in unison. Henry's pale face lifted toward her, hollow eyes locking on her own. Ellen's voice shook. "Henry, what do you want me to do?" The recorder in her pocket crackled. His voice emerged, faint but urgent. "Close it." Her flashlight beam swept across the water and caught something she hadn't noticed before. At the center of the procession, the lake's surface churned violently, forming a dark whirlpool. The boat circled it like moths around a flame. The void was no longer hidden beneath the surface. It was rising, opening, pulling. The current caught Ellen's boat, dragging her closer. She rowed furiously, arms burning, but the pull was relentless. The recorder screamed with overlapping voices now. "Close it! Close it! Close it!" Summoning every ounce of strength, Ellen hurled the recorder into the whirlpool. The voices grew deafening, the water rising higher, as if the lake itself resisted. Then, with a thunderous crack, the whirlpool collapsed. The lanterns flickered out, the boats vanished, the water stilled. Ellen lay slumped in her boat, gasping, the silence pressing in around her. Slowly she rowed back to shore. When she staggered onto the dock, the town was waiting, their eyes wide with fear and hope. She met their gaze and simply said, "It's closed," but even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. Had she truly ended it, or merely delayed what was coming? The lake shimmered behind her, calm and silent, yet watching, always watching. And in the deepest part of her mind, she swore she still heard Henry's voice whispering across the water, "Not for long." The lake lies quiet now, its surface calm, its secrets buried once more. But the people of Graymoor no longer see it as a place of peace. They whisper of Henry, of the divers, of the countless souls rowing in silence beneath the fog. Sheriff Ellen Carver silenced the threshold for now. Yet deep down she knows the water remembers, and one day it will open again.